Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer, bringing you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most from your time on the water. Here's acclaimed fly fishing author and lifelong fly fishing enthusiast, Tom Rosenbauer.
Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast. This week we're going to talk about something that's a little more advanced. Did you know that the best hatch you ever encounter is probably not a hatch at all? What I'm referring to is something that's called a spinner fall. And this is when mayflies return to a river to lay their eggs. And it is the time when it's possible to catch the biggest trout of the season on a dry fly. Let me give you a little background on a mayfly life cycle so you can understand what we're talking about. Mayflies live underwater for just about 12 months. Then the nymphs rise to the surface, they split their skin, and an immature adult emerges from the skin. It's a winged adult, but it's actually not a true adult because they're not sexually mature yet. This is called a dun or a sub-imago, and the dun is kind of an intermediate adult stage. And this is what people refer to when they talk about a hatch. The flies are hatching from the bottom of the river. The fish rise to them. You catch fish on dry flies, but often the fish respond to a nymph or an emerger just below the surface because most of the bugs are under the surface, and then once they hit the surface, they flap their wings a couple times and flutter and fly away. So this is what's called a hatch, and most of our fly fishing literature has been written around, and most of the flies that have been developed have revolved around these duns, the first stage of the mayfly. But the duns fly to streamside brush. They fly to the nearest tree, and they'll stay there for 24 hours or more, depending on the weather. They'll split their skin once more, and they'll come out of this final mold as the spinner or imago, as the scientists call them. And this fly is now sexually mature. The males and females both fly to typically the nearest riffle, and they're attracted to the sparkling part of the riffle, and they'll also be attracted to things like car windshields and roads with water on them because they sparkle the same as a riffle. Typically happens in the evening after the sun goes down, but can happen at any time of day, especially on a cloudy day. And the reason that spinner fishing is so great, fishing to a spinner fall, this isn't a hatch, remember, is that the spinners almost always fall to the water after mating and laying their eggs in a very short period of time. So the trout have the opportunity to feed ravenously in a very short period of time. The flies aren't going to pick up and fly away as they would with a hatch because they're going to die. They're spent, and once they're done mating, they're done for life, and they're spent. And the fish can just lie in the pool below the riffle and sip these things in with a very confident manner. So it's a time when big trout really respond well to surface food, and these things happen all year long. Spinner falls in early spring typically take place in late afternoon. As you get warmer into the season, they happen in the evening and sometimes in the morning. On cloudy days, they can happen any time of day. In the Rocky Mountains, since the nights are so cool, it often happens anytime from mid-morning to late afternoon. So how do you tell the difference between a hatch of duns and a spinner fall? Well, you can take a look at the flies themselves, or you can capture one. Duns have wings that are kind of translucent like wax paper. The tails are not too long, and the abdomen, the body, is usually relatively fat and robust. Spinners, on the other hand, have usually really long tails. The bodies are very skinny, and the wings are clear like saran wrap. They might have little veins in them, but they're typically very, very clear. And duns fly in a fairly slow, clumsy manner when they leave the water. Spinners are very agile. They dart around. They hover over the surface of a riffle, and they'll dip. It almost looks as if they're being pulled up and down on a yo-yo. They'll bounce up and down over the riffle. So how do you tell when there's a spinner fall? Well, often the first thing you know is that you're standing in a pool, and all of a sudden the fish start rising like crazy, and you don't see any bugs. You don't see anything hatching. But if you bend down and look carefully, you'll see these spinners on the surface of the water. And sometimes the spinners fall with their wings upright, but often they fall with the wings spent flat on the surface of the water. And you have to really look closely, particularly if the spinners are smaller than a size 16, to see them. But if you get in the right light and you really bend down and look at the water, you should see spinners on the water. You can anticipate these spinner falls because an hour or two before the spinner fall happens, you'll see the insects massing over a riffle. And the best thing to do is try to get so that you're looking into the sun or into the light over a riffle, and you'll see these insects hovering up and down and shimmering over the riffle. And they'll get lower and lower and lower, and finally the bugs will fall to the surface of the water. The mayflies will fall to the surface of the water, and usually the fish respond and go crazy. If you see insects in the air with bright orange or red or green or yellow egg sacs in the back, you know you've got a spinner fall coming, not a hatch. Fishing to spinner fall is really fairly straightforward, but you need to get an absolutely perfectly dead drift. The fly must float on the surface of the water as though it isn't attached to anything. Occasionally with caddisfly hatches and with mayfly hatches, you can get away with twitching or dragging the fly a little bit. But these spinners do not move at all. Once they fall to the surface of the water, they are helpless and they're pinned in the surface film. So you need to get a really good drag-free float, which means a long tippet, fishing straight upstream to a fish if you can. If not, throw a curve cast or lots of slack in the line so the fly floats absolutely dead drift. The other thing that you need to do is to use, to some degree, a specialized fly. The best flies for spinner falls are spinner imitations or spent mayflies. The trouble is these can be difficult to see on the water because they don't stick up above the water. Very tough to see, particularly in the evening. I find that if the spinners fall during the day or when there's still a fair amount of light on the water and the flies don't have their wings upright, then you need to use a spent fly. You need to either buy or tie a spent spinner, or you can also modify a conventional dry fly. The way you can to modify a conventional dry fly to make it look like a spinner is to take a pair of scissors or your angler's clips and trim all the hackle and the wings off the top and the bottom, so all you have is hackle sticking out to both sides. So you want to flatten the whole fly and make it lie flat on the surface film. If you're fishing a spinner fall toward dark, I find that you can get away with a fly with upright wings, which is great because it gets more and more difficult to see a spent fly in the evening. And the old parachute Adams or a parachute pheasant tail, you can usually get away with those upright wing flies once the light gets really low and it's tough to see your fly. Final word on fishing spinners. The fish are typically easier in the fast water where the spinners fall. And if you can get into faster water, you're going to find the fish are more gullible and easier to fool. However, if you're really after a big fish, the best fish in a pool typically line up in the tail of a pool to catch the spinners because the spinners are concentrated in the tail of the pool. Big fish feel very secure there, and they'll drop way back from the header or from a log jam into the tail of the pool when there's a really good spinner fall. So look for spinners when you're on the water this year. Remember that the fishing is fairly technical, but it's probably your best chance of the season for a large trout on a dry fly. Thanks for listening this week. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to offer some suggestions on things you'd like to hear in the Orvis podcast, drop us an email at podcast@orvis.com. And by the way, if you'd like to see some photographs of these spinners or read a version of this article in print, come to our website, orvis.com/spinners, and we've got some color pictures there of a spinner and a dun, and this may help you learn to identify the difference between the two. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer. Since 1856, anglers worldwide have counted on Orvis to help them get the most from their time on the water. To learn more and to shop the world's finest fly fishing gear, including the award-winning zero-gravity Helios rod, visit www.orvis.com/podcast.